The disappearing cat. Whiskers had been my constant companion for as long as I could remember. A sleek, ginger tabby with piercing green eyes. He was always by my side, whether I was reading a book, watching TV, or simply enjoying a quiet evening at home. He was more than a pet. He was family. His purring was the soundtrack of my solitude, and his playful antics never failed to bring a smile to my face. He was the kind of cat who would follow me from room to room, curling up in my lap during the cold winter evenings or hopping onto the couch to share my warmth on rainy days. One crisp autumn afternoon, I decided to let him outside. It was a ritual we both enjoyed. He would venture out into the backyard, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and I would go inside to finish my chores. There was no need to worry. Whiskers had always been cautious, never straying too far, and would typically be back within an hour, waiting patiently by the door to be let in. But this time, something was different. As the minutes passed and the hour grew later, I began to feel a nagging sense of unease. I glanced out the window, expecting to see him lounging in his usual spot on the back porch. But there was nothing, just an empty yard, the grass swaying gently in the breeze. I called out his name, my voice bouncing off the walls of the quiet house, but there was no response. I stepped outside, hoping to spot him somewhere in the distance. Minutes turned to hours as I scoured every inch of the yard, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if he had gotten stuck somewhere? What if he'd wandered too far and gotten lost? I could feel panic creeping up my spine, but I refused to give in. I went door to door, asking neighbors if they had seen him, hoping against hope that someone had found him and taken him in. I checked under every bush, called animal shelters, even posted online, but nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The night grew darker, and the cold began to settle in. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had taken hold of me. I was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally, but I couldn't stop searching. I wandered the neighborhood until the streetlights flickered on, my heart sinking with each empty yard I passed. There was no sign of Whiskers anywhere. The city was silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I returned home, defeated, and sat down on the front step, staring at the empty yard. My mind kept circling back to one question: where could he have gone? I went to bed that night with a heavy heart, knowing I would never be able to sleep peacefully until I found him. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sent a jolt of hope that maybe, just maybe, I'd hear his soft meow. But nothing came. Morning arrived, and with it, the faintest glimmer of hope. I got up early, feeling the weight of the night's worry still pressing on me. I slipped into my slippers, grabbed a cup of coffee, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The neighborhood was still asleep, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon. I called out his name once more, my voice hoarse from the previous night's searching. Whiskers, where are you? And then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it. A soft, familiar meow. A sound that tugged at my heart like a thread of hope unraveling. I froze. There, sitting on the front porch, was Whiskers. He looked completely unbothered, as if he had never left. His tail flicked lazily, and his green eyes were locked on mine, filled with that usual mix of curiosity and contentment. I rushed over to him, tears welling up in my eyes. Whiskers, where have you been? I whispered, my voice shaking. He blinked slowly, and then he stretched, his body long and relaxed, as though nothing unusual had happened. He purred, rubbing against my legs, demanding to be petted, just like every other day. but something felt off. I knelt down, inspecting him closely. Not a single scratch on him. His fur was perfectly clean, not a speck of dirt on his paws or belly. He didn't look like he had been wandering around all night. He didn't look like he'd been anywhere at all. It felt wrong. It felt impossible. I stood up, staring at him. I glanced at the door. It had been locked all night. I had checked. I hadn't heard him meowing to get back in. There was no way he could have just appeared there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The door hadn't opened. I hadn't heard him scratch or yowl. And yet here he was, sitting in front of me like nothing had happened. I took a slow step back, watching him carefully. It wasn't as if he had just slipped in while I was distracted. No, it felt as if he had been there all along, and the world around me had just paused, maybe even reset. It was like time itself had skipped a beat. I bent down and scratched behind his ears, trying to calm myself, but the questions kept piling up. Had he really been gone? Had I imagined it all? Had I somehow crossed into another version of reality where he was never missing, and the night had unfolded differently? I looked at him again. He tilted his head and let out another soft meow, as though he was asking why I was so strange this morning. "Where were you?" I whispered to him, half expecting an answer. But of course, he didn't speak. He just gave me a look that I could only interpret as, "I'm right here. Everything's fine. What's the fuss about?" I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that hung in the air. I gave him another scratch, and he purred louder, curling into my arms as if to say, "It's over now, human. You can relax." But no matter how much I tried to calm my racing thoughts, there was one undeniable truth. Whiskers had vanished for a full night. And then, just like that, he was back, clean, unharmed, and acting as though nothing had happened. It felt like a glitch, a moment in time where reality had bent and shifted in ways I couldn't understand. What had happened? Where had he been? And how had he returned without a single sign of what he'd gone through? Some part of me knew I would never get an answer, but a part of me also knew this wasn't just some random coincidence. Something strange, something impossible had happened that night. And no matter how many times I tried to explain it, there was only one conclusion that made sense. It was a glitch in the matrix, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. And I, somehow, had been caught in it. The reappearing dog. Buddy was the kind of dog who never left my side. He was my loyal companion, always there to greet me with an enthusiastic tail wag when I came home, and always ready to curl up next to me when I sat down for the evening. He was a mixed breed with a heart of gold, a goofy, happy dog who loved to play fetch, chase squirrels, and run around the backyard like he owned the place. His boundless energy and affection had always been a comforting constant in my life. One sunny afternoon, I was sitting in the living room, sipping my coffee and reading a book, when Buddy darted out the door. I had left the back gate open just a crack, and before I could react, he was off chasing something, likely a squirrel or maybe the neighbor's cat. It wasn't unusual for him to run outside and explore the yard. It was his daily ritual. I didn't think much of it, figuring he'd be back in no time. He'd always return after a brief adventure, happy and exhausted, ready to snuggle up. But this time, something felt different. I looked out the window about an hour later, expecting to see Buddy running around, his tail wagging, or at least resting on the porch in the afternoon sun. But the yard was empty. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe he'd gone off to play with the neighbor's dog or run further into the woods behind our house. I wasn't too concerned yet. It wasn't uncommon for him to get distracted or wander a bit further than usual. I checked the backyard, the front yard, and even the street. No sign of Buddy. He wasn't anywhere in the house either. I called his name a few times, but the silence that greeted me only made my unease grow. I decided to give it some time. He'd always come back after a while, so there was no need to panic. But as the sun began to set and darkness crept in, I started to worry. My mind spun with possibilities. Had he gotten lost in the woods? Was he stuck somewhere, unable to get back? I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to search, calling his name into the still night. The air was thick with the sounds of crickets, and the shadows seemed to stretch forever. I scoured the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen him. I checked under the porch, behind the shed, and even down by the creek near our property. But Buddy was nowhere to be found. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had never disappeared like this before, not without a trace. The whole night felt like an unsettling void, an absence that had replaced the familiar presence of my dog. It wasn't just that he was missing. It was the strange emptiness that hung in the air. It felt like something had been erased from reality itself. The next day, I posted on social media, asking if anyone had seen Buddy, offering a reward for his return. I printed out flyers and put them up around the neighborhood. I walked around, knocking on doors, and even went to the local animal shelters. The hours stretched on with no sign of him. Days passed. I called his name until my voice was hoarse, but still nothing. By the third day, I had started to lose hope. I felt like I had exhausted every option, and the reality of never seeing Buddy again began to settle in. I wasn't ready to give up, but the pit in my stomach had only deepened. I couldn't bear the thought of not knowing where he was or what had happened to him. The silence in the house was unbearable without his bark and thudding footsteps across the floor. And then, on the evening of the third day, something extraordinary happened. I was standing in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when I heard a familiar sound, the soft scratch of paws against the door. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could even process what was happening, I rushed to the door, throwing it open. There he was. Buddy was sitting calmly on the porch, his head tilted slightly as he looked up at me, almost as if nothing had happened. His tail wagged lazily, and he gave me that goofy, endearing look I knew all too well. He looked perfectly fine. No injuries, no signs of distress. His coat was a bit dirty, like he had been rolling in the grass or mud. But he didn't look malnourished or dehydrated. He was the same Buddy that had darted out the door 3 days ago. I stood there frozen for a moment, heart racing, trying to process what I was seeing. How had he gotten here? Where had he been all this time? I crouched down to his level, inspecting him more closely. There was no sign of him being lost or harmed, nothing out of the ordinary. I hugged him tightly, feeling an overwhelming mix of relief and confusion. "Where have you been, Buddy? What happened?" I whispered, half expecting some sort of answer. But of course, all he did was wag his tail, as if to say, "I'm fine. Stop worrying, human." I let him inside, feeling a strange sense of wonder. He trotted in like he had been there all along, as though the last 3 days hadn't happened. I sat down on the couch, Buddy curling up beside me, and tried to make sense of it all. It was as if a hole in the universe had opened up and closed, and I had been left on the other side, watching my dog vanish for days only to return as though nothing had ever changed. The days that followed were filled with questions, but no answers. I couldn't explain where Buddy had been, why he had disappeared, or why he was back without any sign of what had happened. I asked my neighbors if they had seen anything unusual, but no one had. No one knew where he had gone, and no one had heard anything strange. It was like he had simply vanished into the ether and then returned, as if time had briefly been altered. I kept trying to rationalize it, to come up with some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Buddy was back, and that was all that mattered. But the feeling that something unexplainable had occurred, something that I couldn't quite wrap my head around, never left me. It felt like a glitch in the matrix, a rift in the fabric of reality that I couldn't comprehend. To this day, I think about it every time I look at Buddy. I'm thankful to have him back, of course, but a part of me still wonders, where did he go? And more importantly, why did he come back? Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Maybe Buddy had crossed into another world or timeline, a world where I didn't exist, and somehow found his way back. Or maybe the universe just decided to play a little trick on me. Whatever it was, I'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain, I'll never look at Buddy the same way again. The mystery of his disappearance has left a mark on me. A reminder that reality isn't always as solid as it seems. And sometimes, the world shifts in ways we'll never fully understand. The vanishing fish, Bubbles, wasn't just any goldfish. She had been with me for years, a constant companion in my small apartment. From the moment I brought her home as a tiny orange speck, she became a fixture in my life. Her little bowl sat on the windowsill of my living room, the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the glass as she swam gracefully in circles, her tiny fins propelling her effortlessly through the water. I would sit for hours watching her, feeling a sense of calm every time her delicate movement seemed to slow time down. I always made sure to feed her at the same time every morning, just like clockwork. Bubbles had a quirky habit of coming up to the surface and staring at me, as if she knew it was time. She didn't jump out of the water like some fish did, but she would give me that little flick of her tail that made me smile. We had our own rhythm. I would clean the bowl every week, making sure she had the cleanest environment to swim in. She was my responsibility, and I took that very seriously. Then one morning, something happened that I could never have prepared for. It was a typical Saturday, and I had just woken up. The sun was pouring in through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. I stumbled into the kitchen, grabbed my coffee, and wandered over to Bubbles' bowl. I always fed her first thing, as a little morning ritual. I paused in front of her bowl, expecting to see her lazily swimming around, waiting for her breakfast. But to my shock, the water was completely still. No bubbles, no movement. I leaned closer, my heart skipping a beat. Where was she? I stared at the bowl for a few moments, thinking maybe she was just hiding behind the decorative rocks at the bottom. But there was nothing. I tapped on the glass. No response. My mind started to race. Had she somehow jumped out of the bowl? I immediately checked the floor around her tank, but there was no sign of her. I checked the surrounding furniture, every corner of the room, even the filter, just in case she had somehow been sucked in. But nothing. No bubbles. Panic started to creep in. I turned to my family, hoping they had some explanation. Has anyone seen Bubbles? I can't find her anywhere. They looked at me, confused. No one had seen her. We all checked again, and I even called a friend to help search the house. But no matter how hard we looked, it was like she had just vanished. It felt as though the world had swallowed her whole, leaving no trace behind. After hours of searching and growing more bewildered with each passing minute, I began to accept the impossible. Bubbles was gone. I tried to think of logical explanations. Maybe the filter had sucked her up. Maybe she had somehow leapt out of the bowl and hidden somewhere. But no matter how much I turned over those possibilities in my mind, nothing seemed to add up. The more I thought about it, the more surreal it all felt. I spent the next few days mourning her loss, adjusting to the strange quiet in my apartment without the soft gurgling sound of her bowl. I'd cleaned her tank, fed her regularly, and watched her swim around for years, and suddenly she was just gone. The house felt emptier, like something important had been removed from it, and I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I was living in some odd version of reality where my goldfish had simply ceased to exist. A month passed. I had moved on, sort of. I kept the bowl clean, though I didn't replace Bubbles. The emptiness was hard to ignore, but life had a way of pushing me forward. I didn't expect to find her again. I didn't really think about her much, either, though every so often I'd glance at the bowl and remember the days when she'd dart from one side to the other, her fins fluttering in the water. Then, one Saturday afternoon, I decided to give the bowl a proper cleaning. It had been a few weeks, and I thought maybe it would help clear the space. I took the bowl off the windowsill and placed it on the counter, gathering the supplies. As I started to scrub the edges of the glass, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the middle of the bowl, was Bubbles. She was swimming around just as she always had, graceful, content, and completely unaffected by the time that had passed. Her golden scales shimmered under the kitchen light, and she flicked her tail as if nothing had happened, as if the month-long absence was merely a strange dream I'd had. I froze. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. No, this couldn't be right. I dropped the sponge in shock, staring at her in disbelief. I leaned in closer, eyes wide, checking for some sign of explanation. Was it possible that I had somehow missed her? But I knew I had checked every corner of the apartment. There was no way she could have hidden somewhere for a month and just reappeared without any trace. I blinked several times, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Bubbles was still there, swimming peacefully as though she had never left. There was no sign of her being replaced, no markings, no imperfections, no differences in her. It was Bubbles. It had to be her. I sat down slowly, trying to make sense of it. How could this be possible? I thought about everything that had happened, the months of mourning, the endless searching, the strange emptiness in my apartment, and now here she was. It was as if she had slipped through a crack in time, vanished, and then, as though nothing had ever happened, returned. There was no explanation, no logical answer to the question of where she had been or how she came back. It was as if the universe itself had decided to reset. I called my family in, hoping they would see what I was seeing. They were just as dumbfounded as I was. They swore that they hadn't replaced her, that they hadn't put her back. We all just stood there in stunned silence, watching her swim lazily around the bowl, completely oblivious to the confusion she had caused. Was it a glitch in time? A hole in reality? I couldn't say, but what I did know was that Bubbles was back, and with her return came a strange sense of wonder and unease. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Where had she been? How had she gotten back? My mind kept racing through the possibilities, but no matter how many times I tried to piece it all together, nothing made sense. It felt like a crack in the fabric of reality had opened, and Bubbles had slipped through, only to return when the universe decided it was time. Maybe the world hadn't been ready for her disappearance, and now, somehow, it had set things right. And there she was, my goldfish, swimming in her bowl like nothing had ever changed. The sudden silence. Charlie had always been a source of joy in my home. He was a vibrant, green parrot with a fiery personality, a bird who loved to chatter and mimic my words with surprising accuracy. No matter where I was in the house, he was never far behind, perched on his stand in the living room, hopping around his cage or squawking cheerfully whenever I walked in. He had his favorite phrases, ones I'd never heard him forget, like hello or what's up. He'd even mimic the tone of my voice perfectly, making me laugh every time. I had grown so accustomed to his constant noise that it became an integral part of my daily routine. I'd wake up to his enthusiastic good morning, or hear him laughing in the middle of my work calls. Charlie was like a second shadow, always chirping, talking, and filling the silence with his voice. Then, one morning, everything changed. I woke up to an unsettling silence. At first, I thought I was still half asleep, that maybe I hadn't heard him yet. But as I shuffled around the house, the absence of his usual chatter began to feel strange. I checked his cage. It was open, but Charlie was nowhere to be seen. At first, I thought he had just flown out, maybe sitting on his perch by the window or somewhere else in the house. I called his name softly, but there was no response. I looked everywhere, every room, every corner. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the closets, anywhere he might have wandered to, but there was nothing. It felt like he had vanished into thin air. His cage door was wide open, but the latch was still in place. No feathers on the floor, no signs of struggle, no indication that he'd tried to escape or gotten stuck somewhere. It was as if he had simply disappeared. I checked outside, thinking maybe he'd flown away during the night. I went into the garden, scanning the trees, calling his name aloud. I even went to the nearby park, searching under benches and around the fountains, hoping to spot him. But nothing. 2 days passed with no sign of Charlie, and the silence in the house was deafening. I posted on social media, hoping someone might have found him. I printed out flyers, knocked on doors, and even visited the animal shelters, asking if anyone had brought in a parrot. But still, there was no trace. It felt like Charlie had simply vanished, like he had never existed at all. I tried to move on. I thought I'd prepared myself for the possibility that he was gone for good. I cleaned his cage, took down his toys, and packed away his favorite treats. The silence in my home was unbearable. But what else could I do? He was gone, and nothing I did could bring him back. For days, I kept the house quiet, unwilling to replace the sound of his voice with the noise of the television or music. His absence hung in the air like a shadow. Then, 2 weeks later, something happened that I still can't explain. It was a typical Sunday morning, and I had decided to make breakfast. Nothing fancy, just a cup of coffee and some toast. The kitchen was quiet, as usual. I stood there waiting for the toaster to pop, my mind preoccupied with the usual thoughts about work and life. But then I heard it. "Hello!" The sound echoed from the living room, and I froze. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I knew that voice. It was Charlie. It had to be him. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned and hurried into the next room, desperately hoping I hadn't imagined it. When I entered the living room, I found him, sitting calmly on his perch, looking just as he had before. His green feathers were vibrant, his eyes gleaming with that mischievous glint. He was staring at me as though nothing had happened. No sign of being gone for 2 weeks. He didn't seem disoriented or tired. and there was no indication that he'd ever left. He was just there. "Charlie," I exclaimed, rushing over to his stand. "Where have you been? What happened?" But instead of responding with a chirp or a squawk like I expected, he simply tilted his head and repeated, "Hello," in a voice that was eerily familiar, yet slightly off. It was the same phrase he always used, but there was something about the tone, the way he said it, that felt strange, like it wasn't quite the Charlie I had known. I reached out to pet him, but even that felt different. There was a sense of familiarity. Yes, but a coldness too. He had been gone for 2 weeks, and yet here he was, perched in the same spot, as if nothing had changed. I felt an odd shiver run down my spine. I sat down on the couch, staring at him, my mind racing. Where had he been? How had he returned? It was as though time itself had folded, and Charlie had slipped through a gap, only to return with no explanation. His disappearance, the empty days that followed, and now his sudden reappearance, it was all too much to process. I asked him again, "Charlie, where did you go?" But once again, he just repeated the same greeting, "Hello," in that unsettlingly unfamiliar tone. The next few days were a blur. Charlie settled back into his routine, eating his seeds, mimicking my words, and chattering away as though nothing had ever happened. But there was always that lingering feeling that something was different. The silence that had consumed the house for 2 weeks was still heavy in my mind, and the memory of the strange tone he had used when he returned haunted me. Was it possible he had been gone somewhere else entirely? Someplace I couldn't understand? Maybe he had slipped into a parallel reality for those 2 weeks, living in a world where I didn't exist. Or perhaps time itself had stretched in ways I couldn't grasp, and he had returned from an alternate timeline, unchanged but somehow different. I'll never know for sure. What I do know is this: Charlie came back, but the questions surrounding his disappearance will never leave me. He had been silent for 2 weeks, completely absent, and then, as suddenly as he had vanished, he returned. The strangest part? It felt as though he hadn't missed a beat, as though time itself had shifted, and now everything was as it should be. But I still find myself wondering, where did you go, Charlie? And what happened while you were gone? And every time I hear him say, "Hello," I can't help but feel like he's holding onto a secret that, for now, he's not ready to share. The return of the rabbit, Thumper, was more than just a rabbit to me. He was a little bundle of joy, full of energy and life. From the moment I brought him home, he became an inseparable part of my daily routine. He wasn't the type of rabbit who would quietly stay in one spot all day. Oh no, Thumper loved to explore. He would hop around the garden, darting from one corner to the other, sniffing the flowers, nibbling on the grass, and chasing after the occasional butterfly that fluttered by. His favorite thing to do was leap in the air, as though he were trying to touch the sky, his little paws kicking up the grass in his wake. He had this endless energy that was contagious, and every time I saw him hopping around, it made me smile. I would let him outside every afternoon, giving him plenty of space to roam and explore while I went about my own tasks inside. I didn't worry too much. Thumper was always right there, bouncing around the garden, never straying too far. I kept an eye on him through the window, knowing he was safe and content. He loved being outside, and I loved watching him enjoy his freedom. But one day, things changed. It was a normal evening, and I had prepared his usual dinner. I called out for him, as I always did when it was time for him to come back inside. But this time, when I went to check the yard, There was no sign of Thumper. I called his name, scanning the garden, checking his favorite spots under the bushes, by the shed, and near the rose bushes where he liked to dig little holes. Nothing. I thought maybe he had wandered further into the yard, so I looked around some more, but he was still nowhere to be found. I started to feel a wave of unease. Thumper was always so reliable, always there when I called, never straying too far from the house. This sudden disappearance felt out of character for him. I figured he had gone off to explore a little farther into the woods behind the garden, or maybe he had hopped into a neighbor's yard to investigate. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hours passed, and still no Thumper. I went inside to grab a flashlight and checked the entire yard again, calling his name into the growing darkness. I knocked on all of the neighbors' doors, asking if they had seen him. They hadn't. I posted on local Facebook groups, asking if anyone had found a rabbit, and even contacted the nearby animal shelters. But still, there was no sign of him. The next day, I went through the routine of searching again. I checked under every bush, inside every little hiding spot I knew he liked. I even went out into the woods, calling out to him, hoping he would come hopping toward me like he always did. But nothing. The days passed by, and the emptiness of the yard grew more pronounced. Thumper was gone. I couldn't understand it. I spent hours thinking of every possible scenario. Maybe he'd gotten stuck somewhere. Maybe he had wandered off so far that he couldn't find his way back. It didn't make sense. He had never been gone for so long. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, always coming back to the question of where Thumper could possibly be. I kept thinking that maybe something had happened to him. Maybe he'd gotten trapped in the neighbor's garden or fallen into a hole somewhere. But with each passing day, my hope began to fade. A week went by, then two. I still kept searching, but I knew deep down that something had happened to him. I just couldn't believe it. How could he have disappeared so suddenly without a trace? I spent the entire 2 weeks in a fog of sadness and confusion. The house felt too quiet without him. The yard seemed so empty. No little paws hopping around, no happy nose sniffing the air. I thought about him constantly. Where could he have gone? Why hadn't he come back? It was as if he had just vanished, leaving behind only a hollow space that couldn't be filled. And then, one afternoon, something happened that I still can't explain. It was exactly 2 weeks after he had gone missing. I had been sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself by watching TV, but my thoughts kept drifting to Thumper. My mind was heavy with the realization that I might never see him again. I stood up, stretched, and walked to the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the room. I walked toward the back door to check the garden one more time, as I had done so many times before, even though I didn't really expect anything to be different. As I opened the door, there was a rustle in the grass. I froze. There, hopping around in the yard, was Thumper. My heart stopped for a moment. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and then blinked again. No, it couldn't be. But there he was, leaping around in the same joyful way he always had, as though nothing had changed, as if he had never been gone at all. I rushed outside, my legs shaking. "Thumper!" I called, my voice breaking. He turned toward me, his little nose twitching, and bounded over to me. His fur was a little dusty, and his paws had the faintest marks of dirt, but there was no mistaking it. It was him, the same Thumper I had raised, the same energetic rabbit who would hop around the garden every day. He looked perfectly fine, as if he hadn't been gone for 2 weeks at all. I knelt down to pet him, overwhelmed with emotion. I had no words. It was like a weight had been lifted from my chest. I had thought I would never see him again. How could he have disappeared for so long and then just reappear like this? I looked around, trying to find an explanation. Had he been hiding in the yard this whole time? No. I had checked every inch of the garden, every spot where he liked to dig or hide. How had he managed to stay hidden for so long? There were no answers, just the familiar sight of Thumper, happily munching on the clover in the yard, like he had been there the whole time. It felt as though time had folded itself, and for some strange reason, he had simply reappeared. I called my neighbors to tell them he was back, but no one could explain it either. They hadn't seen him, they hadn't heard anything strange, and they hadn't found him in their gardens. It was as if Thumper had slipped out of reality for a while and then came back, as though nothing had ever happened. To this day, I can't figure out where he went or how he came back, but when I watch him hopping around the garden, happily chewing on his clover, I can't help but wonder if he crossed into another reality for those 2 weeks. Maybe he wandered into some alternate version of our world, or maybe time itself had simply warped. Whatever it was a glitch, an inexplicable moment in reality that I'll never fully understand. All I know is that Thumper is back, and I will never take for granted the sight of him hopping around the yard again. The silent phone call. It was one of those nights where everything felt too ordinary. I had just finished a long day and was sitting on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone. The soft hum of the television in the background was a comfort, but nothing exciting was on, and my mind was starting to drift. It had been a quiet evening, too quiet, really. The kind of night where you feel like something just isn't quite right, even though you can't put your finger on it. You know those nights? As I scrolled through my social media feed, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a call from Sarah, my best friend. I raised an eyebrow at the time, around 10:30 p.m. We had just spoken earlier that day, and it was unlike her to call so late. Still, I swiped to answer, hoping everything was okay. "Hey, what's up?" I said, expecting to hear her usual cheerful voice. But instead of hearing Sarah's familiar tone, I was met with silence. Not the usual awkward silence after a call drops, but a deep, unsettling stillness. At first, I assumed the call had cut out or there was some weird network interference. I waited for a few seconds, but the silence stretched on, eerie and thick. I could hear nothing except the soft, rhythmic sound of my own breathing, filling the void. It felt like time itself had frozen. "Hello," I called, trying to get her attention, but there was no response. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, hoping for something, anything, but there was nothing. No rustling, no sound of a dropped call. It was just me, alone in that silence. I stared at the screen, watching the seconds tick by. The call was still connected, but nothing was coming through. My mind started to race. Was she playing some kind of prank? Maybe she was messing with me, but the silence was just off. It didn't feel like her usual humor. I held the phone a little tighter, still hearing nothing. The air around me felt heavy, like a strange pressure was building up. I wanted to hang up, but something in me stopped. Maybe it was that feeling of being in a moment that didn't quite fit, a moment that felt wrong. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to hang up and call her back. I quickly dialed her number again, my finger pressing the call button a little too quickly. The phone rang for a few moments before it abruptly went to voicemail. "Hi, this is Sarah. I can't come to the phone right now, leave a message. I wasn't expecting this. Sarah was usually very responsive. I thought maybe she was busy. So I left a quick message. Hey, you just called, but I think we got disconnected. Call me back when you get a chance. But then something strange happened. When I tried to leave the voicemail, I was immediately greeted by a message saying her voicemail inbox was full. What? Sarah had never mentioned having a full voicemail box before. And on top of that, I didn't hear any of the usual voicemail system prompts, just an abrupt, mechanical message about her inbox being full. I hung up, confused, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach hadn't gone away. Something didn't add up. The strange call, the emptiness, the full voicemail box. It all felt like pieces to a puzzle I couldn't solve. I shot her a quick message, asking if she had called me earlier that night. Hey, did you just try to call me? I answered, but it was weird, no sound at all. I left you a voicemail, but it says your inbox is full. A few minutes passed, and I was starting to think that maybe it had just been some weird network glitch when my phone buzzed with her reply. No, I didn't call you tonight. I've been at home all evening. Are you sure it was me? I stared at her message, rereading it. How could that be? I felt a chill run down my spine as the weight of what had just happened started to settle in. Was that call real? I tried to brush it off as just a bizarre glitch, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. That night, I went to bed, still thinking about the call, about the silence. The air in my room felt unusually still, and every small noise seemed amplified. The hum of the fan, the creak of the floorboards under my feet. It was as though the world around me had gone quiet, too. I tried to sleep, but the unease kept me awake. The next morning, when I finally managed to speak to Sarah in person, she mentioned something that made my stomach turn. She didn't seem alarmed, but I could see that she was still processing something. You know, she said, sitting across from me at the cafe we met at. I had the weirdest dream last night. It felt so real, like you were really there. I was calling you, and I could hear your voice. I even heard you say hello, just like you do when you pick up the phone. But it wasn't really you, was it? It felt like I was calling you, but it was like a dream version of you. I blinked, trying to wrap my mind around what she had just said. A dream? But the thing was, it didn't feel like a dream when I heard her voice on that call. It felt real. Too real. My heart started to race again as I thought back to the eerie silence on the line. What if that call wasn't from this reality at all? What if it was somehow a call from a different version of Sarah, or a different version of me? I don't know what to say. I finally muttered, my voice trailing off. I had a call from you last night, Sarah. It was silent, but I was sure it was you. It felt so real. And then, when I tried to call you back, your voicemail box was full. She looked at me, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to concern. That's really weird. I don't know what's going on, but it almost feels like we had some sort of shared moment, like, I don't know, something crossed over, and we were both experiencing the same thing at the same time, but in different ways. I sat there, feeling that same chill I had felt the night before. Was this some kind of glitch in the Matrix? A slip in reality? Had I somehow crossed into another version of our world? Or had Sarah? And why did I feel like I had shared that moment with her, even though she had never made the call? That call, silent, eerie, and impossible, still lingered in my mind, as though it had opened a doorway into something else, something I couldn't explain. Could it have been a glitch in time or space, a momentary tear between two dimensions, Or was it simply a strange coincidence, the likes of which we can never fully understand? Even now, when I think about it, the feeling doesn't go away. I've tried to shake it off, to explain it away as some weird combination of technology and my own mind playing tricks on me. But there's a part of me that knows something unexplainable happened that night. A moment frozen in time, and a call that, somehow, reached across worlds. And whenever I hear the phone ring now, I can't help but wonder, who's calling, and from which side of reality?